Welcome back, Cyclone Scientists. Today we're going to talk about the theory of evolution by natural selection. Before Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution, there were ideas already out there about how organisms may have changed over time. One of the scientists who had a theory about this was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck said that organisms were shaped by their environment. However, he thought that it was the use or disuse of a trait that determined whether or not it was passed on to an offspring, and whether or not that trait increased in a population or disappeared over time. For example, he thought that giraffes in every generation stretched their necks just a little bit longer to reach the leaves on the tall trees, and by stretching their necks, they passed on the trait for longer necks to their kids. We know that it's not possible to pass on traits that you acquire during your lifetime to your kids now. So while Lamarck got some things kind of right, he also got a lot of stuff wrong. So now let's jump into the theory of evolution by natural selection that was first published by Charles Darwin. There are four key parts, and we remember VOST, or V-O-S-T. So the first part is variation, which just means that organisms in a population will have variations for a particular trait. Now we call this genetic variation, and we know that these variations arise either because of mutations or because of variations through sexual reproduction. So for example, when Darwin was collecting observations in the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that all of the different finches on the island had beaks that were slightly differently shaped. So there were variations in the population. The second key component to Darwin's theory is the idea of overproduction, which is the idea that organisms produce more offspring than the environment can support. Therefore, there is a competition for survival. So he noticed that the birds in the Galapagos laid more eggs than actually survived to adulthood. So clearly there was some sort of competition going on, and not all individuals were able to survive and pass on genes to the next generation. The next and most famous part of his theory is the selection or natural selection part, what's also become known as survival of the fittest, which is the idea that organisms that have those variations that make them well suited to their environment or more fit will survive and pass on those variations to their offspring, whereas organisms that don't have those variations, or even worse, have variations that make them ill suited to the environment, will die and not get to pass on their genes. So for example, in the Galapagos Islands, there might have been on one particular island only very tough, hard nuts to crack available. Birds with slightly larger, more powerful beaks would have been able to survive better and pass on their genes, whereas birds with smaller, weaker beaks may have died off. And so that brings us to the last part, number 4, time, which is this idea that over many generations, the population may evolve. So over many generations of the birds with the largest beaks surviving and reproducing, the whole population may evolve larger beaks. It's key to remember that this happens not to individuals, as Lamarck said, but to entire populations, and that it does not happen in a single generation, as Lamarck said, but over many generations, over a long period of time. So, for example, we could do the VOST for giraffes in order to correct what Lamarck said. So, in a giraffe population, there is variation. Some giraffes have slightly larger necks than others. And then we get to the O. So, there was a competition among the giraffes. There was not enough food for all of the giraffes. And then we get to the S, the selection. So, the giraffes with the longer necks are able to get the food and will survive and reproduce and pass on their genes, while the giraffes with the shorter necks will die. And then lastly, the T for time. Over many generations, the population of giraffes evolved larger necks. Another example of natural selection that we talked about in class was the peppered moth. So in England, before the Industrial Revolution, the bark on the trees tended to be lighter. And so there were variations in the moth population. There were lighter moths and darker moths, but as a whole, most of the population was light. And as we can see, the light moths camouflaged really well with these trees. But then when the Industrial Revolution came to England, very quickly the bark of the trees turned dark from the soot, the pollution that was being released by lots and lots of factories. And so all of a sudden, it was the dark moths that had an advantage, that were able to camouflage themselves. It was the dark moths that survived and reproduced and passed on their genes in every generation, while the light moths died. And so over many generations, but actually within a fairly short time period, this population evolved to have a lot more dark moss than light moss. Today in England, now that the pollution has been cleaned up, we see a shift back towards the light moss because the bark on the trees is again light. So now it's the light moss that once again have an advantage in survival. The last example of natural selection that we talked about is antibiotic resistance. So remember, this is natural selection that can happen very, very quickly in a short amount of time. So here's my original population of bacteria, and you can see that there is variation in the population in terms of their resistance level to antibiotics. This population of bacteria might be living in somebody who has tuberculosis, and maybe that person starts taking some antibiotics but then stops right before they're finished taking them, leaving just the most resistant bacteria alive. These bacteria are the ones that are going to get to survive and reproduce, and in just a pretty short amount of time, we may find ourselves with a bacteria population that has evolved antibiotic resistance. And this is a problem that we talked about some different possible solutions for in class. So I hope this helps explain the theory of evolution by natural selection. Good luck studying for your test.